My best friend invited me to a luxury wedding in Mexico, and 6 weeks before the flight, he called me and said, "Your wife has no place here." Behind me on our bed sat her half-packed suitcase, a yellow dress folded on top of it like a flag somebody was about to tear down. In that exact second, 25 years of friendship died, and it never got the decency of a proper funeral. Here is how it happened, and here is everything that came after, because the phone call was only the beginning of what this man and his fiancée were capable of. David had been my best friend since we were 7 years old. I trusted him the way I trust my own reflection, never once checking twice. I'm an engineer, and I spend my working life hunting for hidden cracks in buildings before they collapse. I never once saw the crack forming in my own oldest friendship, not until it finally gave way underneath me. A year before any of this went sideways, David and I were sitting in our usual booth at the Copper Kettle, a brewery we'd been going to since college, dark ales in front of us, and he was glowing in a way I hadn't seen since the day he got his acceptance letter to grad school. After 7 years together, he told me he and Jessica were finally getting married, and instead of a rented hall and a bad DJ, they were doing something enormous. A full week at a private villa on the coast in Tulum, combining the bachelor party, the bachelorette party, and the ceremony into one unforgettable trip. The kind of wedding people would be talking about for years. Then he looked me straight in the eye, the way he used to when we were kids, and he actually meant something. "Brother," he said, "you're my best friend. You and Sarah have to be there. We're renting the whole villa. All you two need to book is the flights. Everything else is on us. The room, the food, the drinks, all of it." I remember reaching across the table and shaking his hand like we were closing a deal, both of us laughing at how formal that felt. And for a moment it was just two kids again, shaking on something that mattered, back before either of us had a mortgage or a fiancé, or a single reason to lie to each other about anything. I asked him, half joking, whether he was sure he could actually afford all that, and he waved me off, said Jessica's family was putting in a chunk of it too, said the villa owner was giving them a discount because they were booking the entire off-season week. Said it was all handled. Don't worry about a thing. I remember thinking, sitting in that booth, that this was the David I'd grown up with, finally showing back up after years of a slightly inflated corporate version of himself, generous and certain and completely in control. I raised my glass and told him I was proud of him, and he actually got a little choked up, which was rare for him, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. Just sat there in that comfortable silence two people share, when the words underneath a moment matter more than any words you could actually say. We are not wealthy people. Sarah and I work hard, save carefully, and a promise like that meant we could actually go without draining an account we'd built for other things, a fund we'd been quietly growing toward a down payment on a bigger house someday. So we planned around David's word as though he'd signed it in blood. We spent a real chunk of our savings on non-refundable tickets the moment the fares dropped low enough, high-fived each other in our kitchen over the confirmation email, and never once considered that the promise underneath those tickets might not hold. Sarah didn't leave that suitcase alone for a month, buying dresses we could barely afford, holding each one up in the bedroom mirror, asking if she looked ready for a beach in Mexico. I told her she looked ready for anywhere she wanted to be. She was glowing too. That part still gets me the most thinking back on it now. We even joked more than once about which of us would cry first during the ceremony, placing a small friendly bet on it that neither of us ever got the chance to collect. David ran a group chat for what he called the wedding crew, 20-some names deep, and Jessica dropped into it every so often, never to chat, only to issue instructions. "Nobody wears beige," she wrote once. "You'll ruin my shot." Another message, sent at 11 at night on a random Tuesday. "Absolutely no posting to social media until I've approved the official photographer's images first. This is non-negotiable." A third one, a few weeks later, after someone innocently asked whether kids were allowed at the ceremony. "This is an adult, aesthetic event, not a daycare. Please respect that." When one woman in the chat, a cousin of David's, gently pushed back and asked if her 8-year-old could still come since they'd already booked flights as a family, Jessica never answered her directly. She simply removed her from the group chat 2 days later and added a new thread without her. And nobody said a word about it out loud. though I heard from 3 different people that everyone had noticed. A few weeks after that, someone asked in the same chat whether the welcome dinner had a fixed start time so people could plan their travel days around it. A perfectly reasonable question. Jessica's answer arrived an hour later. Please stop asking logistics questions here. David will send a formal itinerary when it's ready. That formal itinerary, as far as I ever heard, never actually arrived, not once. Not for anyone, right up until people were already boarding planes. When I brought this up to David once, early on, half joking, he laughed it off and said, Jessica just liked things to feel spontaneous rather than overplanned. As though spontaneity and simply refusing to tell 40 people what time dinner started were the same thing. I laughed those messages off at the time, the way you laugh off a small stone in your shoe before it turns into a blister. I didn't understand yet that I was watching a woman rehearse exactly how she planned to treat every single person who wasn't standing directly inside her camera frame. About 2 months out, the rumors started reaching me sideways, the way termites show up only after the porch has already caved somewhere you can't see. It started at a neighbor's backyard barbecue of all places, a mutual friend named Tom pulling me aside near the cooler with a beer in his hand and a strange look on his face. Hey, he said, quieter than the music playing behind us. Did you hear anything about people getting asked to pay extra for the Mexico thing? I told him no, and he shrugged and said maybe it was nothing, just something his sister-in-law had mentioned, and then he changed the subject fast, the way people do when they've said more than they meant to and want to take it back. I brushed it off that night, told myself it was probably a rumor mangled twice over by the time it reached me. The way information always warps a little at every hand it passes through at a party. A coworker of David's named Kelly, a woman who'd known him a decade and had been counting on this trip as her first real vacation in 2 years, got a message straight from Jessica 3 weeks before departure. Unexpected logistical constraints, Jessica called it, downgrading Kelly from an overnight guest to a same-day visitor who'd now need to book her own hotel and skip the rehearsal dinner she'd built her whole flight schedule around. Kelly cried in a grocery store parking lot after reading it, not over the money but over how casually she'd been erased. And then the dam broke completely. A couple we knew got asked to chip in for a beverage fund they'd been promised was covered and got 11 days of silence when they questioned it. Another couple got uninvited outright, 19 days out, after their flights were already booked. David's own 23-year-old cousin, Ryan, working 2 jobs to afford this trip, got handed a $90 invoice for a welcome gift basket nobody asked him to buy, and paid it because he didn't feel like he had a choice. Denise, Sarah's own maid of honor, wasted 3 weekends planning a bachelorette party Jessica had secretly outsourced behind her back, and got a single line when she found out. I didn't want to hurt your feelings. Even the photographer, Carla, 6 months into her deposit, got told to just plan for somewhere between 30 and 50 guests and figure it out herself. This wasn't a wedding falling apart around the edges. It was a financial pyramid with 2 people standing untouched at the very top of it and everyone else quietly holding up the weight underneath. I didn't take any of it seriously enough at first. Weddings are chaotic, I told myself. Plans shift. David will sort it out, because that is what you tell yourself about someone you've loved for a quarter of a century. Then, 6 weeks before we were supposed to fly out, my phone rang in the kitchen, David's name lighting up the screen, and his voice was off from the very first word. He talked about the weather for 2 full minutes before he got anywhere near the point. He asked about a project at my firm he had never once asked about in the 10 months since he'd told me the news. I let him circle, because some part of me already knew the water was about to get very cold, and some part of me wanted to give him one last chance to be the man I thought he still was. Finally, he said it. Listen, there's a situation, he said. Jessica finalized the room assignments, and space is a nightmare. There just isn't enough of it. Sarah can't come. There's a bed for me, obviously, since I'm his guy, but not for her. He said he hoped I would understand, and then he actually laughed, a short, uncomfortable laugh, as if he expected me to laugh along with him at the absurdity of it, the way we used to laugh at everything together. I stood there with my hand on the refrigerator door, staring straight through into the bedroom, where I could see the corner of Sarah's suitcase on our bed, that yellow dress folded on top like it was still waiting for a party that no longer wanted her. I asked him to repeat what he just said, not because I hadn't heard it, because some part of my brain needed a second confirmation before it would let the words become real. He repeated it, and this time irritation crept into his voice, as though I were the one causing the problem by asking basic questions. How does a villa's total capacity stay a mystery until 6 weeks before departure? I wanted to know. After 10 months of planning, after group chats and floor plans and photographer approvals, he didn't have an answer for that. He just said it was what it was and that he needed me to be cool about it. Before hanging up, I needed to know one more thing. Was Sarah the only one being cut? He went quiet for a second too long and then admitted there were a few others, though he wouldn't say how many. And he asked me, almost pleading now, not to make this into a bigger thing than it needed to be. Then I hit him with the only question that mattered. Did he actually fight for her at all? Had he told Jessica that Sarah was family, that she'd spent 10 months preparing for this, that cutting her with 6 weeks' notice was going to cost us money we couldn't get back? He was quiet again, longer this time, and then he said, in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard from him, that he hadn't wanted to make things harder on Jessica so close to the wedding. I asked him whether he understood what he was telling me, that he had chosen his fiancée's comfort over his own best friend's marriage without even putting up a fight first. He didn't answer that. He just repeated that he needed me to be cool about it, like repeating the request enough times might eventually make it true. I hung up and stood in that kitchen a long time without moving, one hand still resting on the cold refrigerator door, the beer I'd been about to grab completely forgotten. Then I walked into the bedroom, sat Sarah down on the edge of the bed, and told her everything. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at the suitcase, then at me, and said quietly that she supposed some friendships only look solid from a distance. Then she asked if I wanted tea because that is who Sarah is, offering comfort to someone else in the exact moment she has just been erased by a person she considered family. She didn't stay still for long, though. A few minutes later, she stood up, walked to the bed, and started pulling the new dresses back out of the suitcase one at a time, laying each one flat across the mattress, smoothing the fabric with her palm before folding it again slower than before. The way you fold something you already know you won't be needing where you thought you were going. She held the yellow dress the longest, running her thumb along the hem, and then set it down on top of the others without a word. Later that night, I overheard Sarah on the phone with her mother in the kitchen, her voice low and steady in a way that told me she was working hard to stay composed. I only caught fragments. "No, Mom, it's fine," I heard her say. And then, a minute later, "No, I'm not going to make a scene about it." And then, quieter still, "I just thought I meant more to them than a spreadsheet line, that's all." When she hung up, she came back into the bedroom, sat down beside me, and said her mother had offered to fly out and stay with us for a few days if we needed the company. And I told her that sounded like exactly the kind of thing we might need, though as it turned out, we ended up needing something entirely different instead. Before I called David, I sat with Sarah at our kitchen table and told her what I was planning to do. That I wanted to go in and lay out everything I'd learned rather than just react to the one thing that had happened to us. She reached across the table and took my hand and told me she didn't need me to fight anyone on her behalf, that she'd survive being left off a guest list. I told her this wasn't only about her anymore, not once I'd heard about Kelly and Ryan and the others, that somebody needed to say out loud what everyone else was only saying quietly to each other behind closed doors. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, and said only one thing before I left the house. "Don't do it for revenge," she said. "Do it because it's true." I carried that with me the entire drive to the brewery. I told David we needed to talk in person, and I picked the Copper Kettle on purpose, the same booth where he'd made that promise a year earlier. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he was about to say, sitting in the exact spot where he'd once made a promise he apparently never intended to keep in full. I walked in already knowing about Kelly, about the beverage fund, about the 19-day notice, about Ryan and his $90 invoice, about a dozen small cruelties dressed up as logistics, and I sat down across from him with every one of those facts loaded and ready like ammunition. I asked him first how a villa's capacity could stay a mystery until 6 weeks before departure. He looked down, turned his glass in slow circles on the scarred wooden table, and said they just wanted to invite everyone they loved. And then it turned out there were 20 beds and 40 guests, like it was some act of God rather than a basic failure to count rooms before sending out invitations. I asked whether Jessica had offered any compromise once the numbers came up short. He hesitated too long before admitting her actual solution had been to let the guest list quietly shrink itself through cancellations, rather than change anything on her own end, to simply wait and see who would drop out on their own so nobody officially had to be told no. I asked if he'd ever once pushed back on that, told her it wasn't fair to people who had cleared their calendars for an entire week to celebrate him. He admitted quietly, staring at the table, that he hadn't wanted to start a fight 2 months before his own wedding. I didn't raise my voice. I just started laying facts down on the table between us, one at a time, like evidence. Tears in a parking lot, an invoice handed to a kid working 2 jobs just to be there. A secret organizer hired behind someone's back who'd spent 3 weekends doing unpaid work for nothing. With every single word, I watched David's face change, piece by piece, the color draining out of it. He had walked in here thinking I'd come to beg for a bed for my wife. He had no idea I already knew more about his own wedding than he did. David went quiet for a long moment, and something in his face cracked, just barely, before he caught himself and pulled it back into place. He said he hadn't known about the secret organizer, hadn't known someone had lost 3 weekends of her life over it. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like he was hearing it for the first time and didn't much like what it told him about the woman he was about to marry. For 1 second, I thought I might actually reach the person I used to know. Then his jaw tightened again, and he said none of that changed anything, that weddings are stressful, that people make mistakes under pressure, and that I was choosing this exact moment to hold him to some impossible standard. David's face went from guilt to indignation fast, the way people flip straight to anger the moment they realize they've been cornered with facts they can't argue against. He said I was the only one making a scene, that everyone else had been fine with the changes, that if I were really a friend, I would show up and support him no matter what happened around the edges. He said Sarah could just stay home, since it wasn't her best friend getting married, as if that settled the entire matter cleanly and there was nothing left to discuss. I asked him whether he actually believed that everyone else had been fine with it, or whether he simply hadn't asked. He didn't answer that one at all. He picked up his glass, took a long drink, and looked away toward the bar. And in that silence, I understood everything I needed to understand about the shape of the man sitting across from me. I sat across from someone I had known since before either of us had a single adult tooth, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had no intention of taking responsibility for any of it. They had built an enormous fantasy wedding, promised the world to get people excited and financially committed, and the second reality collided with their budget and their space. They shifted every ounce of that wreckage onto the guests who had trusted them, then quietly blamed those same guests for daring to be upset about it. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. I have spent most of my adult life avoiding it wherever I can, smoothing things over, choosing the quieter path, letting other people win small arguments that didn't really matter just to keep the peace at the dinner table. But there is a particular stillness that comes over me when I watch something genuinely unjust happen right in front of me, and that stillness has nothing to do with weakness. I took a breath and told him, calmly, that I wasn't demanding he conjure a bed out of nowhere if that truly wasn't possible. But if my wife, the woman he had personally invited a full year earlier, the woman who had spent 10 months preparing to celebrate his marriage, was no longer welcome at his celebration, then neither was I. It was that simple, and it was final. His mouth actually fell open. He started in on years of friendship, on loyalty, on how could I abandon him like this over what he called a scheduling issue, but I had already reached into my pocket for enough cash to cover my beer, laid the bills flat on the table, and stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't slam the chair back. I just looked down at him for a second, at the person I used to call first with any piece of news in my life, good or bad, at the kid who used to ride his bike to my house at midnight just because I'd texted him one word, and I felt something close permanently in my chest, quiet and final, like a door being locked from the outside by someone who has already left the building. I drove home with the radio off, the streetlights sliding past in silence, and I found Sarah in the bedroom, standing near the bed with the dresses still laid out flat where she'd left them. She read the outcome on my face before I said a single word. I crossed the room and held her, and she let out a breath against my shoulder that sounded like 10 months of hope collapsing all at once. I told her everything. I told her how I'd cornered him with fact after fact and watched the color drain out of his face the moment he realized I knew every dirty secret behind his perfect wedding. I watched Sarah's own face harden slightly as I spoke, not out of anger at me, but out of a slow, dawning understanding of exactly how deep the rot had gone. Then I pulled the printed confirmations for our own non-refundable flights out of my jacket pocket and told her we were still going, just not to their wedding. We would find a small bungalow on the far end of the coast, away from the villa and its carefully curated guest list, and give ourselves our own honeymoon. No seating charts, no last-minute phone calls dressed up as logistics. She laughed, surprised and relieved, and started refolding the same dresses into the same suitcase with an entirely different kind of energy. No longer packing to impress a bridal party that had never valued her, but packing purely for herself and the man standing in front of her. Word travels fast once one person starts talking, and within days the rest of the guest list found out that Sarah and I weren't coming, and why. News like that moves through a friend group the way a spilled drink moves across a tablecloth. Quiet at first, then suddenly soaking into every corner nobody expected it to reach. The wedding crew group chat, the same one Jessica used to hand down her rules, turned into something close to chaos for about 6 hours straight. Someone posted, "Wait, Sarah got cut? That's messed up." Someone else replied, "I heard 3 other people got cut too. This whole thing is a mess." A third person added, "Honestly, I've been afraid to say anything, but the beverage fund thing happened to us too." David tried to calm it down with a message that read, "Guys, let's not do this here, please. Everyone's excited. Let's keep it positive," which only seemed to make people angrier, since nobody had asked to be told how to feel about their own downgraded invitations. Jessica notably said nothing at all in that thread, though I heard she removed 2 more people from the chat that same week for what she later called negativity that didn't serve the vision of the trip. By the time the chat quieted down, close to a third of the original guest list had either dropped out entirely or was privately telling someone else they wished they had the nerve to. A few people quietly reached out to say they respected it. One old friend from David's side texted me, "I wish I had the guts to do the same thing, honestly, and I didn't know what to say back to that except thank you." A few others told me almost apologetically that they were still going. They'd already spent the money too. And I told every single one of them I understood completely and meant it, because I was never asking anyone else to make my exact choice. David, for his part, apparently told several mutual friends that I had overreacted, that I'd made an enormous scene over what he called a minor scheduling conflict. I found out later that Jessica had described it to her own bridesmaids as Michael throwing a tantrum, as though standing up for your wife were some kind of toddler behavior, rather than the bare minimum a husband owes the woman he married. 2 days after the bar, Jessica messaged Sarah directly for the first time in the entire 10 months of planning, a message Sarah showed me in silence rather than reading out loud. It said Sarah was being a little dramatic about the whole thing, that this was supposed to be a happy time, and that she hoped Sarah wouldn't let one small logistics issue ruin a friendship that mattered so much to David. Sarah read it twice, handed me the phone, and said only one thing. She didn't even say sorry, she said. She just said I should get over it faster. Sarah never replied to that message at all, and I've never respected a silence more in my life. 3 days before the flight, David tried once more, a long text message instead of a call this time, saying he'd talk to Jessica again, and maybe there was a way to squeeze in a cot in the room. Maybe Sarah could stay after all if we were still willing to come. I read it twice, standing in our kitchen, and felt something harden in me, rather than soften. A cot, after everything, offered only once I'd already walked away, and made my absence a topic of conversation among his own guests. I texted back a single line. "It's not about the bed anymore, David." I never heard back from him after that, not until months later. We landed in Mexico 2 days before the ceremony we would not attend. Our bungalow had no infinity pool, no private chef, no white canopy tents arranged for a photographer's lighting. It had a wide, empty beach and a hammock Sarah claimed within 10 minutes of walking through the door. While David and Jessica's guests were packed onto that overcrowded villa somewhere down the coast, splitting bar tabs they'd been promised were covered, arguing over $90 gift basket invoices and downgraded rooms, Sarah and I drank $2 beers on an empty stretch of sand, and it was perfect in a way that villa never could have been, because nobody there was performing anything for anyone. On what would have been the wedding day itself, I got a text from one of the guests who did attend, a woman named Priya, who had known Jessica since college. She wrote that the shared rooms were smaller than promised, and half the guests had been asked at check-in to pay a surprise resort fee. The private chef turned out to be a local caterer working out of a rented kitchen 2 miles down the road, driving trays of food in on the back of a golf cart. At the welcome dinner, one guest actually got into a quiet argument with Jessica's mother over that resort fee, loud enough that a few tables nearby went silent, trying not to look like they were listening. Even Ryan's gift baskets weren't safe from it all. Jessica rearranged them at the last minute without a word of thanks, moving the whole display just to fit where the photographer would be shooting the entrance, as though even his money only mattered for how it looked in a frame. The actual ceremony was beautiful, Priya admitted, but the days surrounding it felt more like damage control. Guests quietly comparing notes in the hallway about what they'd been asked to pay for, that they were told would be free. Her message ended with one line I haven't forgotten. "I'm glad you skipped this one, honestly. None of it surprised me. When you build a celebration on a foundation of convenient promises, cracks tend to show up in more places than just the guest list." Sarah and I flew home a full week later, tanned, rested, and closer to each other than we had been in a long time. In that particular way, a shared hardship can bring two people together when they choose to face it as a team instead of letting it pull them apart. Somewhere over the gulf, Sarah leaned her head against my shoulder and said she didn't regret a single dollar we'd spent on that trip, even the part that went to a wedding we never attended, because it had shown her exactly who was worth keeping in our lives and who wasn't. And that kind of clarity, she said, was worth more than any refund could ever be. We didn't talk about David much on the flight home. There wasn't much left to say. Some friendships, it turns out, reveal their true weight only when they're finally tested against something real. And this one had failed the test completely, at the exact moment it mattered most. Months later, David texted me out of nowhere. "Jessica and I are getting divorced," he wrote. "I really messed everything up. Can I come see you?" I stared at that message for a long moment, thumb hovering over the screen. Then I looked across the room at Sarah, curled up with a book, completely at peace in a way she hadn't been in months. And I thought about a yellow dress being pulled back out of a suitcase, about Kelly crying in a parking lot, about Ryan and his $90 invoice, about every single person quietly erased so two people could have their perfect photographs. I typed nothing back. I pressed block instead and set the phone face down on the counter, and that was the last word either of us ever exchanged. If you think that response was cold, wait until you hear what her own family tried to pull at our wedding 3 years before any of this. The same family that later called me the difficult one. It started with a seating arrangement disaster that nobody warned us about until the morning of the ceremony, and it ended with a demand at the reception that made my own mother stand up from the head table and walk out in front of 120 guests. That story still makes my jaw tighten every time I tell it, and it explains a great deal about why I didn't hesitate the second time around, and why, when it comes to protecting the people I love, I have learned not to wait for a second warning before I act. Some people only learn how a man handles betrayal once, but I promise you, by the time you hear the next one, you'll understand exactly why David never stood a chance against me the moment he made that call.
This story is more than just a personal conflict. It serves as a critical case study in modern behavioral psychology and social dynamics. By analyzing this 25-year friendship's collapse, we explore the sunk cost fallacy, the psychological trap where individuals endure mistreatment simply because of the time already invested in a relationship. Furthermore, this situation highlights a growing societal trend, the commodification of social events. In the age of social media, we see a shift where aesthetic perfection and curated images are prioritized over genuine human loyalty. This video aims to educate viewers on the importance of boundary setting and recognizing social status manipulation in their own lives. Our goal is to provide a transformative perspective on how to protect one's dignity and family integrity when faced with toxic social pressures, proving that the quality of a bond is measured by respect, not just by years.